Hi, everyone. Welcome. Looks like people are starting to filter in to the attendees group. So while everyone is filtering in, I'll just start out with some quick announcements. Thank you all for joining today's webinar, Historic Preservation Planning. I'm Mary Kennedy, the current board president of the APA St. Louis Metro section. Whether you're a planner in the St. Louis region joining us or an allied professional or outside of the St. Louis region, we're thrilled that you're here. So before we get started with the actual webinar, we have a few announcements. First, we want to thank our annual section sponsors, CBB Transportation Engineers and Planners as our flagship winter workshop sponsor this year, as well as our community connector sponsors, HNTB and Moran Economic Development. The support of these organizations makes all of our programming, scholarship programs, webinars, and social events possible. So thank you so much to our sponsors. One of our signature events is coming up soon, so we wanted to share a save the date for that. Our summer picnic will be Wednesday, June 24th from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. More details coming soon, but wanted to get this date on everyone's radars. The event will include an educational session. Lunch will be provided, and this event is always free to our section members. And if you're interested in becoming a member, feel free to reach out and we can provide more information about that. Also upcoming this month, we're having one of our informal coffee meetups on Friday, April 24th from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. at the Richmond Heights Panera. So that's the Panera near Big Bend and Clayton. It's always just a good chance to meet other planners from the region in kind of an informal and relaxed setting. And the section provides coffee, so makes it a little easier to just jump right into meeting other people. And then in addition to those events, a few announcements. Um, for anyone interested in or planning to take the AICP exam this year, the registration window opens May 4th, and test dates are available beginning May 4th through September 30th. They kind of changed the testing windows this year. Rather than having two shorter windows, there's one larger window. And you can learn more at planning.org. If you're interested in serving on the St. Louis Metro Section Board in 2027, now is the time to nominate yourself or someone else and work alongside a great group of planners. After nominations close, elections will occur in late summer and early fall. Serving on the board is a great way to get involved, give back to the planning profession, build relationships with peers in the region. And so nominations are currently open and they close May 17th. To learn more, you can go to our website or sign up for our newsletter where there's more information. Also, our strategic plan is currently open and will be available for responses until May 31st. This will help us plan out the section's priorities over the next 5 years, and we'd love to hear from all of you to see what kinds of events, advocacy efforts, communications you'd like to see from the section. And then finally, a plug for our mentorship program. This program pairs early career planners with mentoring planners who have substantial experience and expertise, and is a great way to build those relationships. You can also learn more about that on our website. And here is a QR code that can take you to our newsletter sign up. If you're not already subscribed, we send it every other Friday with an occasional off-schedule e-blast about special announcements. You can also follow us on LinkedIn or visit our website at the URL listed there. So with that, let's get started on today's topic, historic preservation planning. Our two speakers are Laurie Matthews and Marcia Boyle. Laurie Matthews, FASLA, is Director of Preservation Planning and Design at MIG and a nationally recognized expert on cultural landscapes. Her work has helped rehabilitate some of the most iconic historic places in the country, such as Yosemite National Park, Point Reyes National Seashore, and Crater Lake National Park. Laurie's work is guided by the principle that preservation requires managing rather than halting change, especially related to the complex histories of landscapes. Laurie has an MLA and a BLA from the University of Oregon, where she also teaches in the Historic Preservation and Landscape Architecture departments. Marcia Boyle, AICP, is a senior project manager at MIG that focuses on historic preservation and long-range planning. Marcia has worked with communities across the country to identify, evaluate, and protect historic resources, and to think more broadly about the contribution of historic resources to a community. Marcia utilizes a variety of tools and management systems for historic resources and frequently partners with communities to plan for long-term success of historic preservation programs. Marcia has a BA from St. Olaf College and a Master of Urban Planning from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So now I will hand it off to our speakers. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please add them to the Q&A, and then we will address those questions at the end.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mary. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right, I think it's loading. All right, you guys able to see the presentation? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you guys so much for inviting us today. We really appreciate it and are excited to talk about historic preservation with you all during your lunch webinar session today. It looks like there's a good number of you online, and I really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us today. We want to talk about preservation kind of from a variety of lenses during today's session. A lot of times preservation is thought of as just the built environment and just thinking about how we preserve what's already constructed. We want to challenge that a little bit and say that, yes, it does include that, but it also needs to have kind of a wider conversation around how we approach these resources. There's landscapes, there's intangible heritage, there are stories that go beyond just our built structures. And you can approach those from a variety of kind of points in your communities. You might be at the point where you're just starting to think about preservation. Maybe you're at the point where you have a lot of designated resources, you have preservation plan, you have ordinances, and you've run into some challenges. So we want to recognize that probably on this call, all of those perspectives and those points are represented. And that's a good thing. And that means that preservation is part of the conversation. We want to make sure that it is part of the conversation as much as possible for everybody in attendance here and beyond. We really do think that preservation is a key aspect of any community. So we're approaching it today from that lens. And again, as Mary said, we're happy to kind of take questions and talk about that with those on this call too, to figure out how it makes the most sense for your community. We did intros a little bit already, or Mary did our intros for us. Thank you for reading those bios. I guess we'll just add maybe a couple things. I'll add that I'm from the St. Louis area, so I'm really excited to get to chat with you all today. Grew up in Wildwood, stuck in the Midwest for college and then grad school, and still have family in Wildwood. So I'm very excited to get to talk with you all today. Laurie, do you want to add anything to your intro?
Yeah, I'll just add that I've worked across the country, so I bring a slightly different perspective and just happy to be here with everybody today.
Great. And we want to take just a minute before we dive into some of our content to just see who's on this call. I know we can see your names in the kind of attendee list. I believe the chat feature should be open, and it would be great if you're able to type in there your name, title, or organization, basically who you work for. One question not on here that we would love to know a little bit about, and it can be brief because I know you're going to type it, is what attracted you to come to this session? Are you deep in the throes of a preservation challenge and you want to figure out if there's solutions? Is your community just now talking about historic preservation and you want to kind of see where you might start? We're just curious kind of who's here and how we can best address maybe where you are in the preservation journey. So I'll maybe give this just a second here as people start to populate the chat, and it does look like it's open, which is great. So we'll let those kind of come in as we as we talk through the presentation today. You can also use the chat feature if you'd like to put questions. You can use the Q&A feature or the chat feature. We'll be monitoring it. I know Travis and Shelby and Mary are monitoring it as well. So plenty of opportunity to kind of ask those questions. We can pause during our presentation and answer questions as well. But appreciate people starting to kind of populate this. It looks like a lot of public sector employees so far. Wouldn't be surprised too if there may be some consultants on here, but this is great. It's very helpful to kind of see who's here. Someone has a very robust preservation program. That's great. Launching a program. Okay, so very different stages. That's great to see. We'll keep the presentation moving, but keep those answers coming in. We'll continue to look at them as we go. I'm going to turn it to Laurie to kind of introduce a little bit about MIG and our Cultural Places studio.
Yeah, so as Marcia mentioned, kind of one of the reasons we're going to be talking about planning, but in terms of preservation, there's a lot of other pieces that go into planning. And then there's also the, kind of what comes next. So, planning is really kind of the linchpin. So I just wanted to say that at MIG, we have a Cultural Places studio where we are looking at these issues very broadly, nationwide, at all different scales and all different kind of resource types. Next, Marcia, if you don't mind. And what that entails is we have a fairly broad bench of expertise. And these are some great colleagues that we get to work with. My point being here is that we are trained as landscape architects, we are trained as planners, we're trained as historians. So it really does require a broad kind of bench or kind of array of expertise when you're thinking about historic resources, especially at all the kind of different kind of levels. And we are, as you can see, kind of mainly West Coast into Denver in the Midwest, but we are kind of scattered around kind of the western side of the country. Next. And this just shows kind of broadly, just to kind of give a sense of the types of places and projects that we've worked on. You can see we've done some work in Missouri at Herman and Wildwood, as Marcia mentioned. But we work with a lot of national parks, cities, communities, public agencies, state parks, and the like to really help them kind of understand their resources and start to think about planning for them, designing and constructing kind of places. So this is kind of what I was talking about, is that we're going to really be focusing on kind of what, as planners, kind of where that intersection lies in terms of all of these different kind of aspects and stages of preservation work. But the planning, as you can see here, is really the keystone. It's like the top piece. It's kind of the linchpin between all of these different kinds of aspects. And so if you're going to be doing some really good planning, you need to think about the research or the analysis and evaluation if that hasn't already been done. And obviously, as planners and designers, we also want to think about implementation. And so what does that look like in terms of how do we move a plan or a planning construct into implementation in the community that can really make an impact. So these are kind of the five kind of stages of preservation planning and design that we work in as a team and that are kind of part of the process. And as thanks Marcia, kind of, bringing people in and asking kind of where you guys are at in this process will really help us kind of understand kind of where you're at in this kind of this range of types of projects. Next.
All right, and so we're going to kind of dive into those different approaches. We have a lot of examples of where to start from a planning perspective, because as Laurie said, that is the linchpin, the key aspect of it. And then there are a lot of supporting kind of tools and ways to approach things as well. And from just like scanning through some of the responses in the chat, it seems like people are at very different points, which is great. We sort of expected that. And we hope that some of kind of the examples and conversation will help you figure out where you currently stand maybe, and then opportunities to begin the conversation if you haven't already, or kind of figure out solutions. So the first piece is kind of the regulatory legal aspect of a preservation program, developing your historic preservation ordinance. These are two examples on the screen, obviously from different states. So they're, organized slightly differently, but there are similar elements in each. A community can decide which elements are most relevant to them. You can see that kind of key to both of these or are there historic districts, as well as their HPC or HARB, as it's called in Pennsylvania. You're probably most used to historic preservation commissions. You might have a design review committee. They're called different things in different places, but establishing that body is really important. Establishing requirements for that group to make sure that they meet what those are. Sometimes to become a CLG as well, you've got to kind of meet those certain elements. So outlining kind of that range of things, obviously the State College one on the left is a little bit more detailed in its table of contents than the Littleton one on the right. But establishing your ordinance is really crucial. And I will say as part of this too, taking the temperature of your community to see, is that something, is having a historic preservation something of interest in the community? And I see that a planner from Ladue even, mentioned that there isn't a preservation program right now, but there are advocates in the community for the program. So perfect example of you've got to see, is there interest? Are there resources? Should a program be established? So that is step one, is to really get that in place. And from there, if you are just beginning the process, or if you're partway, you're a few years in, creating a historic preservation plan is a great way to work with the community to examine the work you've already done, but then to kind of build off of that and figure out, what are you going to do over the next 5-10 years, and how are you going to advance the program, continue doing great things you're doing, but advance it further. One recent example for us currently going through the adoption process is the Wildwood Historic Preservation Plan. We've been lucky enough to work with the City of Wildwood. I know I saw Joe's name on here, and maybe Robin hopped on too. So really appreciate their partnership. And Travis is with the city as well. And we've really enjoyed working with the city on creating a historic preservation plan to really highlight all the success that they've already achieved, and then figure out what can they do in the next 10 years to build on that and make sure that they're also getting the full community support behind them. So a preservation planning process is a key step in kind of driving that forward. From there, a set of implementation tools is really crucial. So something like a design manual, you may have design standards or guidelines that are specific to a historic district. Maybe they're tied to a design overlay, a conservation district. There are lots of ways that you could approach this, but thinking about those historic resources, this is really a built environment focused implementation tool, but figuring out the right approach. Is it you want to address infill so that it's compatible infill? Is it standards and guidelines focused only on preserving historic buildings and identifying those key character defining features to then write into your standards and guidelines? And then the other question is it a separate document from your zoning code, development code, whatever you might call it in your community? Or is it something that's integrated, which often would mean standards, but which approach do you use? And there's pros and cons of both, but having a design tool so that especially your HPC can point to something and say, this is what we're holding applicants, property owners, developers to, and gives you that legal basis to make sure that you're keeping your historic districts in place. So thinking through that tool, there's a lot of options to kind of consider with this. And this is one example from San Marcos, Texas. And these images are of their downtown square, but gives you kind of a sense of here are the features that we need to preserve, and then moves into the standards and guidelines to support that. Training is a really crucial part of a historic preservation program. We've done these trainings both for municipalities before and for national organizations where kind of municipal HPC members come together. But making sure that training is given both for new HPC members so that as they dive in, they know what the kind of requirements are, the legislation they're following, the resources they have. And then also making sure that training is renewed, whether it's annually, maybe it's every other year, but having that kind of reminder, making sure your full HPC is on board, on the same page, and that as staff, you can rely on them to be making sound decisions, and that your city attorney isn't questioning what they're doing in the meetings. You want to make sure that they are really kind of trained up and know their stuff as they go into HPC meetings. And then another aspect of this, which may resonate with a lot of folks on the call, is the importance of historic preservation as kind of a a single part of a lot of bigger projects often. Sometimes you may have a project that isn't just a preservation project, but is addressing a corridor or maybe a small area plan. But thinking about the historic resources as part of that is really crucial. And as advocates for preservation, and maybe your HPC kind of gets involved with this sort of thing too, you really want to make sure that at the planning stage, the historic resources are considered a key part. So this is just one example from Santa Barbara, thinking through kind of the structures that are existing as well as the ages. And then from there, developing documents, and maybe it's just a short report, maybe it's a little bit more in-depth analysis, but some sort of baseline to say, this is what we have, this is the history of these resources. Based on, this analysis, here's some strategies in this larger planning effort. It really takes all of us to be advocates for historic preservation in big projects like this, where transportation may be the focus, but historic resources are also crucial to that area. You can use a document like this to highlight those characteristics and continue advocating in recommendations and in implementation for maintaining and keeping those resources.
So I'll pick it up from here. And those are just really great points. Like I think when we're talking about our communities, we love what's unique about it. And that's kind of the bottom line here. That's kind of the goal here, is to try to keep those things that a community feels are special or unique to them. And speaking of the Santa Barbara project, this is a project in Portland, Oregon that actually started as a master plan for a historic promenade park, but actually started to include transportation. Like, how do you fit a multi-use path, bikes, peds, everything through a fairly dense urban area with a lot of museums and historical societies and churches and concert halls, a university, without kind of damaging or kind of impacting adversely some of the kind of trees and canopy. Marsha, if you can hit the next one, that would be great. And kind of giving a sense of, how do you kind of maintain the things that were really important to people? There are these really there are these really majestic elms that frame this pedestrian promenade. And then how do you kind of put the green loop path, which you can see on the left there, how do you tuck it in so that it doesn't impact the strong pedestrian promenade? And it also allows for parking, sidewalks, and access for cars. As I mentioned, we're trying to kind of be multimodal in this particular area of Portland. And so this planning process allowed us to kind of think about some of the codes that the city of Portland has, from the tree code to transportation goals, and then kind of give it a little bit more life in terms of like, how do those things come together in a space, when you start to design it. So this is considered planning for sure, but it's moving a little bit closer to design. Next. The other thing that's really critical, and I mentioned it at the kind of the onset, is there is a research and analysis piece. Like, you kind of need to know what you have. You kind of need to know what the history is. And I think for those of us who have lived in communities for a long time, we have that knowledge, but not everybody does. So there is a real value to doing research into kind of a various place. Herman, Missouri is here, so we're doing a historic concept study for parts of Herman, and kind of understanding what the history is there and how layered and deep it is. In addition to some of the places here in Oregon, a summer camp in Willamette Falls, which was a very critical place at the end of the Oregon Trail. So understanding those kinds of layers just allows that knowledge to move forward into some of the planning processes, and kind of understanding what the character is of these places, so that we have a sense of what we're trying to preserve or what we're trying to kind of recognize. Next, sorry. This is another great project. So this is analysis and evaluation. So you have some of that research, and I know that Marcy mentioned it a little bit before. Like, Littleton, Colorado had these great, they had done a survey actually of a lot of these different resources, but hadn't really looked at the mid-century modern. So we were able to take some of the research that had been done previously and verify it and add to it and do some field work and kind of understand these resources. I think we're just starting to kind of understand the value of the mid-century modern period, but it can coexist really wonderfully with design trends of earlier eras. And Littleton, Colorado, like I said, there was this basis of information that we were actually able to kind of work with and kind of base our analysis on and kind of move that forward into a format that will be more useful for Littleton, Colorado moving forward in their planning process. Next. And this is kind of just giving kind of a sense of like how we were kind of ranking things in terms of like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and kind of just showing, especially on the right-hand side, kind of what some of the changes have been since the previous work had been done. Honestly, we all know how planning goes. Like you try to do some of that work initially, and then time passes and you have to kind of revisit it. So this is a great way to kind of update stuff and use some of the information that has been developed in the past and kind of build on that. Because these processes they do take some time. Next. So design, obviously a lot of these great ideas are, like we want to kind of preserve our communities and we want to kind of, bring these places back that really serve as a unifying aspect or kind of a way to link and kind of increase people's connection to community. This is actually a really great success story that started from something that wasn't actually was kind of a tragedy. So this is an elk fountain. It's at the heart of the city of Portland. It's right in kind of the civic area and district. And it has a really interesting history in terms of this being a place where First Amendment rights and a lot of kind of community gathering occurred as early as when it was developed. And then in 2020, when there were a lot of protests following Floyd's murder in Minneapolis, the fountain got damaged quite a bit, and so had to be removed. A lot of it was damaged. You can see on the right that the area where the fountain was also removed. So next slide. So we were tasked with looking, how do you bring this back? How do you kind of redesign the streetscape to increase access? How do you kind of put it back? One of the things we were trying to do was also to make it a recirculating fountain so that we were, not using water kind of uselessly. And this was a unifying factor for the city of Portland. And it just actually got unveiled. Next slide. Just got put back and unveiled over the weekend. And it was like people were crowded around this area of Portland. It has been just a real light of a kind of ray of hope for the city of Portland and kind of bring this back. So the whole process in terms of the research analysis, the design, and now the implementation has been a really great success story for this community. The other one to talk about is like construction. So this, this is a research project. We understood this is a college that is actually built on a former kind of Beaux-Arts era estate. They had this swimming pool that you can see on the left. It really wasn't used by the students very much. And then there was actually also some kind of a tragic accident that occurred here. And so the college was not interested in maintaining or keeping the pool. And so we looked at kind of what is the character of this place? How do we kind of honor the pool and kind of the gathering space that it was and create a place that is more contemporary and modern and can be used by students? I mean, the photograph on the right is taken in like February and there's a student like laying out on the ground. Like it's just, they want to be here and they want to be in this place. But you can also see some of the touches, some of the new plantings that will mimic some of the plantings that were there historically, the use of the pool handles to kind of bring a kind of a touch back to the artistry of the original campus design. And then next. And also kind of creating, in this next slide, a place of really gathering. So a lot of the different classroom, kind of academic classes like music and theater and other ones wanted to use this space for like outdoor classroom space. And so we designed a place that can kind of accommodate that. It's not large scale. This is a kind of a smaller college. It doesn't overwhelm kind of the historic gardens there, but it creates a much more usable space than what you can see is on the left, especially in a place like Oregon where we have a lot of rain. And so this area is typically not used as much during the academic year. Next. And so one of the things, just to kind of end on this, there's there's a lot of what we see as trends. I think as Marcia kind of began the session, she was talking about how there has been a real emphasis on the built environment. And I think now we're focusing more, and that's still true for sure. Like that's kind of the linchpin of a lot of the work that we do. But there are other factors involved. Like placemaking grounded in authenticity, like understanding what these places are that we call our communities and what's special about them, and trying to enlist or kind of create ways of honoring that. And I will say to that point, sometimes the process of developing a plan or engaging with the community is just as important as the plan itself. The education that happens during that process for the people who are involved, colleagues of yours and the community, is almost just as valuable as actually the product of it. And that actually gives you this opportunity to think about what is the character of my community, what is authentic to this place. And that creates the opportunity to have this kind of placemaking outcome from that process. Next. So some of the other trends that we're really seeing is climate change resilience. We do a lot of work in this area, especially with national parks, but thinking about how we can mitigate for higher temperatures, how we can mitigate for stronger storms, flooding, wildland fire. There are a lot of ways that these resources can actually, or kind of thinking from an historic preservation lens, can help us increase resiliency for our communities. Obviously, trees can be impacted in our parks, our historic parks, but if we can continue to have plantings there, we will create shade and kind of create better kind of climate. In terms of like flooding, there are ways to kind of think about increasing places where water can go safely, so that it's not impacting other critical resources. So looking beyond just the resource is really important in terms of developing resilient places to climate change impacts. Next. And places of conscience. I think we are thinking about places in terms of like, what are the stories that they tell? There's such a greater array of stories about the American experience than we have typically done in the past. And these are two that kind of highlight that. One is the home of Queen Liliuokalani in Honolulu, who was the last queen of Hawaii. This is currently the governor's mansion, so it still has a real strong part to play in terms of their kind of political leadership. But there's another story to tell about the Queen and her advocacy for the rights and the culture of the Hawaiian people. And on the right-hand side is the Sand Creek Massacre. This is in Colorado, just talking about the massacre of bands of tribes by the U.S. Army. That was a really tragic event, and working with tribes in that region to make sure that their ancestors are honored in a very respectful way. So those are things that I think are really important for people to understand, not to shy away from those kinds of stories, because that actually can really bring people together. And in terms of thinking about healing in places of community. Next. And then just resource values management, kind of thinking about not just the built structures, but the landscapes themselves. The right-hand side was the California Capitol in Sacramento, and they were doing a very large kind of addition or annex to this particular property. And so how did we work with them to enable that modernization to occur while still retaining some of the really critical kind of historic aspects of this campus, not just the building itself, but there's actually a whole park associated with this, and really kind of creating a place for the community of California to come and honor their capital. And I'll turn it back over to Marcia.
And our kind of last trend that we wanted to highlight is the importance of celebrating intangible heritage. As preservationists, we talk a lot about tangible versus intangible heritage. Those tangible resources are the built environment, things you can see, things that as preservationists, sometimes we get the reputation of, I'm going to go chain myself to that building or that tree because someone's going to tear it down. That is the tangible resource that we think about. But the intangible piece kind of provides that character and that interesting thread through the community stories and um, really tells the history of a place in a way that's a lot more um, textured, I guess I would say, than just the built environment. Events, that storytelling piece, protests, those are all pieces of intangible heritage that maybe don't specifically link to one place. If you moved it and it was, it still occurred or continues to occur like a recurring festival, it's still really important. So taking the place specificity out of something and realizing, this is still an important piece of our story is really important. And I think kind of through all of these trends, something that we both were hitting on is the importance of community involvement in preservation, that it's really the story of your community. The places of conscience, I know, has been highlighted by the National Trust for Historic Preservation as well. They're really realizing, I think Laurie was alluding to this, of our designated historic resources in our country, throughout the country, are not representative of the true stories of our community. They are currently primarily about white men and white male history. That is changing. There are programs to focus on designations for African American stories, Indigenous history. So it's changing. And as a trend, we want to make sure that that's something that you all are thinking about too, and expanding that story of your community beyond maybe the easy to find research. It is a lot harder sometimes to figure out the information about those stories, and you need to engage with those communities. Maybe it's collecting oral histories and other things that are just passed down. It may not be a written book or an article, but it's there. And so kind of figuring that out is really important. So again, kind of figuring out the approach to preservation for your community is a good starting point. There's a lot of different ways to approach the topics you're running into, issues you're finding. I know preservation can be a hot topic in communities if there's a demolition that's proposed, or maybe there's a big new development, but demolition has to occur first. There's kind of a lot of ways to think about this and to approach it. But we're glad that you all are here to really think through this and figure out the right approach. We hope for your community, or maybe it's just of interest and it's something that you're thinking about all the time. So thank you again for joining. We've got plenty of time for questions, and I think maybe I see some coming in, but before we jump into those questions, there were a couple notes in the kind of intro chat too that I just wanted to highlight as well, of specific things that people had brought up during their kind of intro presentation or intro notes. So there was one great point from, I believe it was Dawn, about historic preservation and housing stock and the impacts of preservation on housing stock. And I really appreciate that point. It's not something we specifically address, so I want to make sure we talk about it. We talk a lot about the naturally occurring affordable housing in a community, and that is often the structures that are already built. So sometimes those are historic, sometimes they're not. But making sure we have tools in place to preserve those, and that as a community, we're valuing those resources and putting time and money and effort into maintaining them so that they can continue to be part of the housing stock. And it isn't just tear down, build new. I think the character piece is also a crucial part of the housing conversation with historic preservation, but generally with historic preservation, that those resources provide a lot of character that you don't always get with new build. Of course, people have preferences, but making sure that historic preservation is part of the conversation when it comes to housing is really important. I know there were notes about mid-century modern district creation, which is exciting to hear. You saw the couple slides about Littleton, which is, it's not a historic district either. That is something as part of that project that we are figuring out, if those kind of commercial historic resources or commercial mid-century modern resources are of historic value. That sort of tiered system that we had on the slide as Laurie was explaining, the kind of analysis procedure, is a way to figure out, there's 4 tiers in that particular example. Do all of those tiers really warrant designation of some sort? Is it maybe tiers 1 and 2? Is it a historic district? Is it a design overlay? Are there individual designations? There's a lot of different ways to approach that particular project, and likely in, I think it was Crestwood, in that example as well, that, figuring out what is palatable. Are they all done by the same designer? If so, great way to think about a potential historic district. And even if not, still potentially have a historic district. But it sounds like that sort of analysis, evaluation, and maybe the research component are just as important there as the planning and figuring out which tool to consider for that particular potential district. I'm seeing, let's see, community development goals and how preservation supports those goals. That's sort of a kind of general question that I hope we're starting to touch on, but the importance of thinking about the character of place. I think using the terminology historic preservation sometimes is challenging for people because there's a certain connotation associated with that sometimes. But if we change that to the character of place, that's often something a lot of people can get behind. So thinking about how you approach the conversation around historic preservation and ask people what they love about their community. And if it went away, what they would be upset about. There may be big preservation losses that a community has already felt, a historic building that got torn down for new development. That's an easy thing to talk about. But then there's the smaller buildings or the landscapes that maybe have been lost that are also part of the conversation. And sometimes removing the term historic preservation and focusing on a different aspect of it is a helpful way to look at it and get some preservation advocates that may not think that they're preservation advocates. Okay, I think those were the main things noted um, in the chat originally.
Yeah. And I'll just add to that. What I hope kind of overarching in terms of our talk here and just kind of showing a variety of examples, obviously not all planning, is that this profession, this practice has often been seen as the no, like you can't do that, you can't do this. And it shouldn't be that way. This is a way for people in your community to think about what's unique and character defining. And there are a lot of creative ways of making that happen, of being able to preserve those places, but still be contemporary and address things like accessibility and climate change and new uses of spaces. Like, I mean, I'm coming at this from a cultural landscape lens, which is a little bit more pliable, but I think that it's starting to impact the way that we think about the built environment and the intangible resources as well. And like I said, and like Marcia said, historic preservation comes with a lot of kind of negative baggage for a lot of people. So to have starting the conversation in a way that's like, what is important to your community and how do we implement some of those ideas is a good place to start.
So Marcia and Laurie, I'm going to jump in here. We do have some questions in the Q&A. One is, excuse me, in your experience, where do historic preservation plans most often break down between vision and implementation? And what have you seen actually work to bridge that gap?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one really important aspect to avoid the breakdown is having a robust set of implementers. You can't just rely on staff and you can't just rely on your HPC. Preservation should be approached from a community perspective. And we kind of mentioned it before that there are advocates in your community for preservation that don't think they're preservationists, but they can help with the implementation. So maybe it's, the public library can help implement one specific program, one specific task, and that helps distribute the kind of load of what implementation looks like. Something that always comes up and is always a challenge, especially right now, is funding. And being creative in where you find grants from local, statewide, national perspectives is really important because we need to make sure that we're diversifying funding sources. I know it's especially a challenge right now, and there's a lot of communities going through budget shortfalls that they're having to solve. And so money might get taken away from something like a preservation program. But if you can advocate for preservation again from a different lens and how it relates to other comprehensive plan objectives or goals that you're implementing kind of simultaneously, that's a way to continue to thread that needle and make sure that it is a priority for the community.
And I'll just add on to that. That's where the process of doing the plan is so critical. Like engaging people with the community, you're going to get a lot of buy-in in terms of the implementation if you do that. The other thing that I would mention is there's usually something kind of bubbles to the top as part of that process, something that's kind of an easy thing to implement or an easier thing to implement. And it's really critical to really latch onto that and act on that kind of one thing that can drive the community. As I mentioned, the Thompson Elk is something that the city of Portland did to really, it wasn't only just about preservation, it was really about downtown revitalization. And it got a lot of people thinking about like, how do we kind of put our energy into the city that we love in a way that's like impactful and concrete. And that was the project for this particular community. And so those are those are the kind of two tricks that I would use the process to kind of get buy-in engagement and highlight something that you can implement fairly easily or with kind of broad community support to kind of spark future implementation.
Thank you. So, you may have noticed in the chat we have a number of elected folks, as well as people on historic preservation commissions, or however they call it. And we also have a question regarding, let me find it here. Anything beyond the trainings that you mentioned in your presentation to build capacity for those folks, the elected folks and the volunteers, as well as the staff for different municipalities?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is sort of a training opportunity, but more of an educational opportunity is sending people to conferences. The National Alliance of Preservation Commissions is a great one. I know Wildwood takes advantage of that. But also statewide local conferences to learn what other communities are doing is a great way to kind of get creative about things and see what some solutions are that maybe are a little outside the box, but something that you could take home. It also helps people connect with other staff and commission members or elected and appointed officials, so that you can have that kind of support network, which is always crucial with preservation, even if it's someone from across the country. Having that network that you can call up and say, hey, we're dealing with this issue. Have you dealt with this? Do you know someone that has? I think that's always a good thing to kind of establish that network.
And I'll add that there's usually some partnering agencies that are also aligned with some of the work that you're doing that may not consider themselves preservationists, but maybe they do. Nonprofits that people can align with. And I'll say that kind of in that same vein, and kind of to touch upon a point that Marcia made in response to the first question, is a trick is to kind of find out where is the funding. So if the funding isn't preservation itself, where is the funding and how can we use that funding to increase community buy-in for, kind of preserving historic character? And I'll use an example that's, probably outside the realm of a lot of what you guys are doing, but in the National Park Service, there was a lot of funding going towards wildland fire mitigation, trying to reduce the damage that would occur with that. So we actually started to pair some of our research and kind of implementation projects with that funding so that we were protecting resources that were going through kind of a mitigation process, and use that funding that was at that point fairly robust and using it in a way to preserve some of the historic resources in those areas. So look, follow the money. Where's the money and how can we use it to kind of build community? And are there ways that preservation can be part of that conversation?
Where's the money? Always good advice. Thank you. So you spoke a little bit about the public engagement as part of the historic preservation planning effort. Can you speak more about maybe the public engagement that is done with design projects, construction projects, research, et cetera?
Yeah, I'll take that. Those are kind of three different kind of areas of process. For the research side, we are never starting from scratch. We are almost always building off someone else's research. And wherever possible, we actually bring those people into the process because they have incredible knowledge. I always say that as a consultant or someone coming into a community, you guys know the resource great. We have the expertise in terms of what to do with that information, but as much as we can rely on the people who know this place the best is going to help all of us, kind of dive down into that process. In terms of design, I think there should be just as much of a robust community engagement process as there is for any planning project. Making sure a community is at the table, having like a community, like a citizen board as part of the process of the design process. Construction's a little bit harder to be honest, because um, the yeah, it's moving fast. There's a lot of kind of pieces that are occurring. I will say that one trend is the construction management general contractor process, where you are, as a designer, you are starting to design the project along with the person who's going to construct it. And so there's a lot more opportunity to have that engagement and have those conversations. So the implementation actually becomes something that you envision. And that is where that community process can actually start to bleed into and kind of influence the construction down the road. Marsha, you may have additional things to add.
No, I think those are great, and Lori has kind of more experience on that type of preservation work. I think the key piece too that you mentioned is engage with people that know the community. Just last week, we attended an open house for that Littleton project actually, and um, the unofficial city historian was there, and he's been doing that work for 40 years, worked for the National Park Service as his career, and is slowly working on retiring, but just the wealth of knowledge in a 20-minute conversation, and then the opportunity, to call on them for future input, is really vital, and is something you can't always get from reading 50 books or whatever it might be. So finding those people, and often you guys probably as staff in these communities know who those people are, or your colleagues know who those people are. So really tapping into those existing resources. Don't feel like you have to kind of create that from scratch. It's there that you've got to find the right people to build that network.
Thank you. And we do have one more question, but I'd encourage folks, we do have some time. If there's other questions, put them in the chat or the Q&A option. This next question, I know that we grapple with this here at the City of Wildwood. Robert Myers asks, address how the historic preservation profession defines historic and how to decide what that word means in each individual community.
Yes, I mean it is a mystifying process, and it gets bogged down by a lot of very technical language that I think just does none of us any good, to be quite frank. But to kind of boil it down, we actually use a slightly different term. We say contributing or non-contributing versus like historic or non-historic. And what we mean by that is there's like kind of two filters that you're thinking about. One is this place or resource significant? Is it tied to something that's at, kind of an important event, or is it an important designer? Is it an important uh, kind of, place of some way? And that can be at the local, state, or national level. Does it have significance? Is it important? The other one is, does it have integrity? Again, this is where the terminology can kind of get in our way, but does it have enough there? Is there enough, if it's an intangible resource, is there enough of a community that's kind of supporting this idea and this story? If it's a tangible resource, is there enough that is there to convey what that resource was? And the litmus test that I often use is, if the designer came back, or someone who lived in this community during that time period, if they came back today, would they recognize this as being that place? That's kind of my kind of, big picture kind of litmus test. If you've got those two things, it would be considered quote unquote historic. But I also think about the word contributing kind of means something more to me, because it's like, does it contribute to this time in history, or this significant event, or this significant person? And does it still kind of retain its kind of essence? That's kind of the terminology that I use. So that the process of the research and the analysis and evaluation, that kind of the two bubbles before you get to the planning piece, that's where those questions typically need to be answered. And there are a lot of ways to do that. There is the more formal process of doing a national register or a state register listing. But if you're working with people who have the expertise that we kind of mentioned at the beginning, you can kind of you can do that as a part of the planning process, and make those, feed off the existing research, maybe add in and kind of fill in gaps where you need to, like the Littleton project is highlighting, and then do an analysis and see kind of, where is, kind of what would we say is going to be contributing to this significant place. And that's kind of the process that we would go to. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I might add to the idea of the 50-year mark is something that is discussed, like it has to be 50 years old to be significant. It's a very detailed part of um like the legal aspect, I guess, of preservation, but I would say that that is a conversation starter. Communities set that kind of threshold differently, but there may be resources you have in the community that aren't quite 50 years old but are threatened, and maybe thinking about ways to preserve them and make sure they don't get torn down or don't get built over, whatever the case may be, should be part of that conversation. And there's a lot of those kind of standards set at the national level by the National Park Service, things like the Secretary of Interior standards that are a basis, but then allowing for some contextual creativity and flexibility to make sure you're truly addressing your community's needs and it's not a copy paste because those standards are written at a very high level and not for one specific community. So making sure that you're tailoring things according to what your community needs is really important. And defining historic as it makes sense for your community. And then again, thinking about tangible versus intangible resources that it may be it may be different than what the kind of national standard is, but you really got to figure out what works for your community and how to implement that.
That's a great point. I just want to add on to the whole sometimes knowing the reason why those kinds of parameters are put in place is really helpful. The whole point of that kind of 50-year mark, which has become kind of like this like line in the sand, was really to say how much time do we as a community need to have some perspective of a historic event or design trend or whatever to be able to look at it with some objectivity. That was the main goal. But you don't need to have that necessarily for all places. For example, I was involved in doing evaluations of some of the places that were impacted by 9/11, in particular where the plane crashed in Pennsylvania. We knew at the moment that that was a significant place of remembrance that we needed to think about from a kind of a preservation standpoint. And so we didn't need 40 or 50 years of perspective. And you can think about resources that are less than 50 years. And it's also not, it's not like everything that's 50 years or older is significant or historic. But just that's not the purpose of the process.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Mary to close us out.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Laurie and Marcia, for leading a great presentation and doing a great job answering all of those good questions. The conversation was really interesting, and I know I learned a lot. So thank you so much. And thank you to all the attendees who joined us this afternoon. This session has been recorded, so it will be available on our YouTube channel, and we'll share that out in our newsletter and social media as well. So thanks again, everyone. Hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Have a great
Thank
day.
you.